So now, with that kind of base of understanding from chapter one, now we turn to chapter two, and we're looking at basically the money system and the payment system that underlies it. And things are, as kind of even as evident in the last chapter, things get more complicated than you originally thought they were, right? When we think of money, we just think of currency that's like sitting in our wallet or something like that. And it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. So let's complicate it. Um, when we talk about money, the group that we need to talk about is the central bank, the Federal Reserve. The central bank, we talked about in the last chapter that one of its job was the lender of last resort. But for economists, why we would think it's important is because it controls the money supply, which, depending on your economic beliefs, the money supply can control quite a bit about the performance of the economy. And probably, so as we talk about the money supply, how much money exists, and the power that the central bank has over it, it becomes pretty important pretty early on in the discussion that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, needs to be kept independent of politics. Um, I don't care. Honestly, I really don't care, and I really do mean it when I say it. I do not care what your political beliefs are, and you should not care what my political beliefs are. The difficulty from 2020 is that you have a president, a presidential candidate, when he's running in 2020, saying that he's upset with the Federal Reserve Bank and that if he has his way, that he will replace the Federal Reserve Chairman. Now, it's not, personally, if you want to know my belief, I'm no like huge. Sorry, it's not like I'm a huge fan of Trump personally, but again, you shouldn't care what my beliefs are. But he's not the only example of a person being upset with the Federal Reserve Chairman. Almost all presidents have been at some point. Um, but the only other person that kind of comes to mind as a person kind of crossing the line would be Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon was president from his first term was from 1968 to 1972, and in 1972 he was trying to be president again, and he was running for reelection. And in running for reelection, you typically want the economy to be strong so that people vote you back into office again because they're like, oh, he's doing a good job. And so the only way that he could get that, not the only way, but the way that he tried to get that to happen, because at the same time, remember, we were sending people to the moon still, right? The Apollo missions were still going on. We had people fighting in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was still going on. And we were spending a lot more money on government welfare programs or social assistance programs that had been started during the Johnson administration in the mid 60s. So here I'm talking about things like food stamps, Medicaid, um, uh, Section 8 housing, Head Start program. All of those programs that dramatically reduce poverty in the United States, all of these things are costing a lot of money. And so he went to his good friend, Arthur Burns, to, the two of them met. And from what we can tell from journals and whatnot, is that Nixon pressured Arthur Burns to um, put more money in the economy, to make the economy do better, to lower interest rates. The consequence of that would be that, well, Nixon was reelected in 72, but the other consequence of that was that we got incredibly high inflation in the late 70s. Incredibly high. And that was incredibly bad. And it's just this long story I tell you is just an example of why you want to keep politics out of the central bank. Other examples we have here are Zimbabwe, where the central bank in Zimbabwe was not independent of the political leader, Robert Mugabe. Um, and Robert Mugabe essentially, his politics of displacement of white farmers with um, not even really African farmers, but basically taking the land of farmers who were white and redistributing it to others, and then fixing the economy by having the central bank um, print more money, um, caused incredibly high inflation. And that's what we see at this last bullet point here, is that to the extent that the central bank cannot be independent of politics, you tend to see inflation. Now, let's go to this here. There's actually been some really cool research, right? So you could read this from the tapes, the Nixon tapes. You could actually read some pretty cool papers, some academic research talking about how Richard Nixon pressured Arthur Burns, Federal Reserve Chairman, and that obviously the consequence of this was some pretty high inflation. A really cool paper. It almost tempts me to assign it to all y'all, but maybe I will. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Sounds like a threat, but it's not. The You don't really see a lot of Ben Bernanke as Federal Reserve Chairman during the 2007-2009 crisis. Ben Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression. His PhD dissertation was on the Great Depression. So he certainly was going to keep independent of the politics of the situation. And, and the consequence of that was that we really didn't see, for the most part, we didn't see any inflation after the 2007-2009 crisis. I don't really know. I mean, I don't get the sense that Jerome Powell is any close friend of Trump during the 2020 time period, but what do I know? I'm just an economist. But in terms of the question here, should the central bank be independent of the rest of the government? Again, the general consensus is that yes, it should be the case as in a way to control the economy. Now, money. So this kind of is a review somewhat of what you would have learned back in principles. But money is anything that is accepted as payment for goods and services to settle debts. Anything, really, right? Why, when I get my paycheck every 2 weeks, I'm paid in dollars, US dollars. I wouldn't accept anything else because the people I owe money to want US dollars. So I don't want to get paid in Canadian currency because all I would have to do is have to spend time turning it into US dollars. I don't want to get paid in Bitcoin or some cryptocurrency because all I would do is spend all my time turning it into US dollars. This slide and this slide alone, slide 6, chapter 2, this is why economists do not believe that crypto, whether it be Bitcoin or Dogecoin or whatever any of those things are not money. I don't know anyone that accepts it as payment in order to settle debts. You get some examples, like I think you can buy like a Domino's pizza with Bitcoin, or like you can buy a Tesla, I think, with like Dogecoin or Bitcoin. But all that those companies do is they immediately turn it into US dollars. So it's just kind of like a marketing play, really, if anything. Merchants will take, if you're close enough to the Canadian border, they'll take the Canadian currency, but they really are only taking the Canadian currency just to turn it into US cash, US dollar. If we did not have the US dollar, or if we did not have money, the economy is then dramatically smaller, because then everything has to be done through a system of barter, and it's incredibly inefficient. Barter typically has what's called a double coincidence of wants, which means that if we had a barter system and you were taking this class, I would have to creepily find out what can you give me that I would want in exchange for me delivering to you this lecture, right? I don't need a dozen eggs from your family farm. I don't need a used car from your family's, car lot. Right? I mean, it's okay in developing economies where you do see this kind of thing happening, where people exchange food items for different goods and services. But as the last line points out here, it's incredibly inefficient, and you tend to really only see it as an economy is just starting to emerge, not an advanced economy. So we have this double coincidence of wants, as I just said. Each party has to want what the other is giving. But as I identified as well, the transaction costs are pretty high. You have to actually transport this good, exchange the good. And so that would mean that each good then has many prices, as opposed to the current situation where this course is being offered for a pretty standardized US dollar amount. That would mean that if we wanted to find out how many different prices there are, if there are n number of goods that exist out there, then that would be n times n minus 1 divided by 2. That's going to be a lot of goods. If we have 5,000 goods, that would be 5,000 times 4,999 divided by 2. That's going to be a lot of goods. And you can see then how difficult it would be to both accumulate wealth, but also how difficult it would be to exchange goods and even list the prices of different goods. So then how do we get money? Well, we do have two different kinds of money. We do have the very first kind of money that we get is commodity money. That would be basically gold, silver. And the very first monies that we see that emerge come from goldsmiths in Europe, where people don't want to be carrying around lumps and lumps of very heavy gold, right? So you could lose it, it could be stolen. You instead would leave it with your goldsmith, right, who would then store the gold and give you a certificate, a piece of paper that would say you can turn this in for this amount of gold. That piece of paper then becomes your commodity based money, because now you can use that piece of paper to exchange it for others for that equivalent amount of gold. Up until June 5th, 1933, we had a gold standard here in the United States. Well, from about, 1890 something to June 5th, 1933, we had a gold standard in the United States. And then one of the very first acts of President Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression was to take the US off the gold standard. And that became effective again June 5th of 33. We have in the United States here a fiat currency, fiat money, meaning that the only thing that gives the US dollar value is that it is by law is something that has to be accepted. If you look on your currency, there's a statement on there that says this note is accepted for all debts, public and private. It is by US law that you are allowed to use currency to pay things, right? So, yeah, you always see those stories where, the guy gets a parking ticket or a speeding ticket and then becomes a complete asshole and pays it with pennies and stuff. Well, technically, it's legal to do that, I suppose. It's just that you're being you're being an asshole. Um, but we see with money as well is that allows people to specialize because now what they can do is they can accept this common thing, gold or gold based standard, or just money in general, and then they can use that to buy the other things they need. Right. So I don't work for yes, I work for my food, but I don't grow my own food. I earn money and I use that money to buy the food that I need. That specialization then that occurs as people are producing things allows people to be more productive, and it allows the economy to grow much, much faster. And you see, um, I mean, for anyone that's traveled to a foreign country, um, I was in Zimbabwe in 2000, 2001, 2002. I've been in Mongolia in 2009, 2010, 2011. Both developing economies, both economies that experienced dramatically high inflation. Not only did I not hold very much of the currency, the local currency, but I did generally find that dollars did most of what I needed to do, or cigarettes, to be honest, not just Marlboro cigarettes, but really any cigarettes are a pretty useful commodity money to use. No one wants to accept, in this case, the ruble in Russia in 1989 or the Zimbabwean dollar in the early 2000s because the value of that currency is dramatically falling as inflation goes up. Now, why is that important? Well, from slide 12. What does money need to do to exist? Money needs to do these four things. These four things are the most important thing that money can do. And when it doesn't do these things, it is not money. So now this is what? Slide 12, chapter 2. The other reason why I and almost any other economist of any worth that I know would say that cryptocurrencies are not money is that cryptocurrencies don't fulfill these four conditions. US dollars are the thing that we use to exchange goods and services. The US dollar is the thing we use as a unit of account, meaning it's the thing that prices are listed for me. The US dollar is the thing that is storing its value over time, and that I'm saving for the future with dollars. And that I borrowed money in terms of US dollars that I will pay back in the future. Let's look at each of these functions. So, medium of exchange, what am I accepting as a good or service? Unit of account. It is the thing that's on the price tag, 3, but it's dollars. So it's the unit of account. Storing its value over time. I could put currency under my mattress at home or in a drawer, and I know that it would retain some value over time. But it's also that standard of deferred payment that if I borrow money, I'm likely going to be paying it back in dollars over time. Cryptocurrency doesn't do any of these things. Well, I guess it stores value over time, but we don't really know what that value is going to be. What Bitcoin sells now for over 70K, but just a few years ago it was like 11K. So it's not really storing its value with any consistent fashion. It's not really being accepted as a medium of exchange for most intents and purposes. I don't see very many things being priced as a unit of account. And I can't borrow things in terms of Bitcoin. Again, I'm not trying to be a crypto hater here. I'm just saying it's really not a form of money. So we need to distinguish also then between what is wealth, what is money, and what is income. So wealth would be kind of the accumulation of assets over time, subtracting out your liabilities, the things that you owe. Um, Obviously, what I do right now is I earn income. The idea is that I'm going to earn a lot of income now, and that there was a time in my life, what, 20 years ago, where I wasn't earning anything because I was a student, and that there's going to be a time in the future, 15, 20 years from now, where I'll be earning less because I won't be working. So I have to use my income, my flow of income right now, my flow of money right now, to be able to save money, store it, essentially have it as wealth that I can then draw upon when I retire. Um, how something becomes a medium of exchange typically means that it has these characteristics. I don't have any elite. I mean, it's not like I'm super patriotic and would say I accept the U.S. dollar because it's the U.S. I use the US dollar because I don't encounter very many people, if any, that don't accept US dollars. So, since it's acceptable to most people, the US dollar has become our medium of exchange. It's pretty standardized, it's increasingly theft proof, it's highly divisible, right? I can turn large notes into small notes, I can turn notes into coins, um, and it's pretty durable. And the Federal Reserve note, basically US paper currency, you'll see meets all these criteria. It is a fiat money that has no value outside of the actual paper that it's printed on. So it is what causes some people a great deal of concern. The US money supply, the amount of fiat money that we have out there, has no value outside of the actual paper. How much do we have out there? Well, got pretty good data on this. Let's go on the Federal Reserve Economic Database website. Let's find out how much currency has been issued. Currency in circulation. Oh, yeah, so we have quite a bit. And obviously, the rate of change has increased dramatically since COVID. Now, if you have a certain belief system about who's managing things well or not well, the part of the concern here would be is that the dollar is becoming less valuable because we're printing a lot of it and it doesn't really, there's nothing that's underlying the value. So this isn't like um, Fort Knox where we have gold sitting around and people are that this currency is based on the amount of gold that exists out there. Oh man, there's like this really scary, what was this? Um, I forget how to spell his name, Mnuchin. Here we go. Steve Mnuchin, who was the Treasury Secretary under Trump, went and visited Fort Knox, where a whole bunch of gold is kept. Um, Not entirely clear why. This is just the U.S.'s warehouse of gold, but it has nothing to do with uh, the currency that's being printed. Um, there's Mitch McConnell. Oh, interesting. Well, look at it. You sign your name, I guess, when you go to visit it. Um, Interesting. Hmm. Actually, gold is actually very heavy. If you've ever picked up a gold bar, it's incredibly heavy. Um, I've picked up a few in my life, and yeah, they're pretty heavy. Okay. So yeah, we see this right here, right? So now we've got a lot more currency in circulation, almost $5,200 for every person that exists. But the most surprising thing is that most of the currency that has been printed is actually held outside of the United States. So other countries use our dollars both for illegal activities, as the kind of last bullet point highlights, but also as their primary currency. Because why make your own money and worry about it when you could just use the US dollar as your official currency? which is what Zimbabwe does, Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama. I mean, quite frankly, if I were to start my own country, probably what I would do. Why go to the expense of starting your own currency? Just use the US dollar. And so you see, you know, and if we were to continue to graph this out, we saw that the pace, that the slope changes quite dramatically here as well at that point. Most of what's being printed are $100 bills, which remains one of the largest denominations that exist out there. There used to be a 500 euro note, which was the largest, but basically the $100 note is among the largest in the world. So that's about 80% of the value of all the currency that's being issued. And then what we start to see is evolution in the payment system. Like, how do we move this money around? Um, as I highlighted in my earlier story, we saw a pretty significant change when we changed from a commodity money to a fiat money, because we then didn't have to like lug actual gold around. We could use these certificates that were based on the gold, these paper certificates. Um, and again, up until 1933, um, up until 1933, you could exchange US dollars even for gold. So the US dollar used to look different before 1933. Let's look at this here. I'm just going to type in 1932 US currency. I'm going to click images so that you can just see that it looked different. This is good enough. So you can see that it looks different. So you can see that kind of red circle, but also look at what you see right here. The lines on the bottom are different. It says the United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $2. Wait, this is from, what year is this from? This is from 1953. Sorry, this isn't old enough. Sorry. I need older. Let's go with this one here. I want a picture. I want a picture. Sorry, I'm looking for a picture of what it looks like here. Here we go. Now you can kind of see it, kind of. It's not very good though. It's hard to see it. But anyway, it doesn't matter, I guess. But basically, you could take this currency, let's for instance, this $20 bill, and you could turn it in at a bank for the equivalent amount of gold. Obviously, that doesn't happen anymore. When I worked at the Federal Reserve, the most important thing we did was checks, which I realize today. I mean, I still write checks, but I'm getting the sense that I'm old fashioned. Each district bank, each district, so I was in District 7, we had, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we had 7 offices that processed checks. So the idea was that you would write a check, the bank would accept the check, and that check would then be given to the district bank, the Federal Reserve District Bank. And the district bank would charge about 87.5 cents to process a check. To take basically money out of one person's bank account and put it in a different person's bank account. We just don't use checks today like that anymore. We don't use paper checks. We've made it a lot more efficient by doing what are called ACH transfer, automated clearinghouse transfers, which is essentially checks or just electronic checks. Why do we do that? Well, checks again are a little bit clunky. They're expensive to process. and you have to actually trust that people are writing checks that actually have money in their accounts. Um, and so we, with the Federal Reserve, we have things called like FedWire, we have the ACH system, and basically the Federal Reserve built a payment system that is faster, more secure, more efficient, does more international transactions with something that we have called the SWIFT system. Um, and all of this is designed to make payments flow faster. I mean, if you're interested in that, um, the SWIFT system. I mean, if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's a pretty cool system where this would be how money travels between countries, and it was started about 50 years ago here. Um, but again, it's how um, the international financial system is able to exist. Okay. So again, we have these ACHs that exist that I already said. That would be typically how your payroll is. How my check gets to me. When I get paid. I think one of my very first jobs, I got paid with an actual physical check. But then obviously it changed over time, such that it's directly deposited through the ACH system. And then we obviously don't really go to branches as often anymore. We usually use ATM machines and whatnot, and debit cards, and even just other payment systems like Zelle and whatnot. Zelle is something that is actually run by the banks themselves. Um, our payment system in the United States, the way that it's set up, the real time payment system, it um, operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. One of the problems that we have, though, with the current system as it's kind of designed, as we think about the way that it's being redesigned, is that right now, people get paid Monday through Friday. So what happens is that, right, for me, I get paid on the 5th and the 20th. If the 5th and the 20th happen during a holiday or during a weekend, I get paid before that date or after that date, primarily because the ACH system isn't operating anymore. So obviously, if we were redesigning the system, we would redesign it such that it was working more days of the week, but that it was also a little bit more secure. And so you get this system outside of the ACH system, which again, I referred to it a little bit. You could get things like FedWire, but also you would get this system called FedNow, which is the kind of the current system that is being built that's going to replace the ACH system. So FedNow, it was a little bit delayed during COVID, but the FedNow service is kind of still in the, I would say, developmental phase. Um, so we have the ACH system, and then um, you have things like Zelle, which the banks did. But I mean, look at that transaction costs of basically 4.3 cents per transaction. Compare that to what I just said. That checks used to cost 87.5 cents per check process. So it's a pretty significant. It's a pretty significant reduction in the price of the system. So again, ACH is largely being replaced by FedNow. It's still being developed, though. I guess it's really, again, the best way to say it. If we were to have this class 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we probably won't even be talking about ACH anymore. We'll probably be almost entirely talking about FedNow. Okay, and then we have I've kind of already dissed on it enough. I don't need to focus on the textbook dissing on it more, but again, e-money, I don't know, it's kind of a little bit of a clunky term there. But we've got things like, again, e-money or cryptocurrency, which are not really money, in my opinion. It's debatable. I mean, if you want to debate it with me, you can, but um, it's just not. The general opinion is that it's not really useful as money. And again, we have these other things like Libra, Dogecoin, and you've got a blockchain that kind of underlies it. Honestly, I mean, I understand a fair amount about cryptocurrency, about the infrastructure underlying it, but there's a fair amount I don't know as well. So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on. Um, um, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on cryptocurrency, but again, it largely is not going to be a money that exists. Now, other things like Apple Pay and Google Pay, that's not money. It's actually just a better, faster, lower cost way to link our current bank accounts and whatnot to be able to pay people money much faster. Um, I mean, you do see in other economies, like in Sweden, um, I was going to say also like in China, where you see mobile banking apps being used to quite a bit to transfer money. I don't remember what the China system is called. Uh, yeah, WeChat Pay or Alipay. These are used quite a bit, and I think they use um, and Union Pay. Union Pay is actually part of the Discover card. The Discover, like the Discover card, that like credit card that like our parents and grandparents have. Its most probably valuable investment it has is that it owns a huge chunk of Union Pay. But different countries do different things here, and what we're just trying to say here is that in different economies like that, in Sweden, they don't use credit cards as often as they use a form of direct transfer of money. Now, let me just pause here. Sorry. So as I said, kind of at the beginning of the lecture here, what the central bank does, the Federal Reserve does, is it controls the money supply. So then the natural question would be well, what is the money supply? So economists measure this in terms of degrees of liquidity. Liquidity meaning the how quickly can we turn whatever it is into cash. Um, and so M1 is considered the most liquid of money. That would be then actual currency and checking accounts. And the way that this is structured is that it's set up kind of like a pyramid. So you've got M1 here. So it'd be just like actual cash, checking accounts. And it also includes traveler's checks, which you don't really see people use those too often anymore. And then you build on top of it things that are a little bit less liquid. That'd be things like savings accounts, large CDs, certificates of deposit, money market accounts, things that can be turned into cash, just not as fast. And when you combine those two things together, that's what we then call M2. So M2 is going to be everything in M1 plus some of the things that are a little bit less liquid. Then you get to M3, which is even like very large institutional funds, like let's say $1 million or $2 million, pension fund or something like that. I think it goes all the way out to M5, if I'm not mistaken. Now, we can see this right here that most of the money that exists out there is actual currency. But like a good financial system, we don't have to like guess what's all in these things. We can go back to this Federal Reserve Economic Database and we can find out what the size is of M1. Sorry, I don't know why it's not. So we've got M1 right here. Right, and we can see that M1 grew dramatically with COVID, which again fills in the theory of why we had such high inflation. Now M2 should have the same shape. Let's actually add it to this so we can kind of see kind of what's going on here. Because right, M2 is going to have everything in M1 plus some of the less liquid things. And so we see again that same shape here. And so again, M2 is everything in M1, so that's the red line, and so it's obviously going to follow the exact same shape. Now look at what's happening here though. Look at the difference between the two lines is getting dramatically smaller. So what does that mean? That means that most of the COVID change there, what that was more liquid things being issued, like currency. And that people took that money and, at least initially, put it in their checking account, kept it in very liquid things. But now we see that a difference emerging again here, starting in 2022, 2023, where basically people are spending down their checking accounts, spending down their COVID money. And we start to see the emergence once again of this money. Let's look at this over the 5-year basis. I mean, look at that. So although I kind of dismissed in the previous chapter just how significant COVID was as a financial situation, it did dramatically change the system, and we can kind of see that here. Okay, let's go back here, and we can see traveler's checks. I don't even think I list them here. But then again, you get the other things that make up things like M2, which the largest part of that would be the savings accounts right here. So M2 has everything in M1, plus then less liquid things like savings accounts, small CDs, and money market accounts. We already looked at this data, so you don't, nothing worse than looking at old data. Just use the Federal Reserve Economic Database, FRED, online, and you can kind of see kind of what's all going on there. Okay, now why does the supply of money matter so much? Well, one of the things that we can use to talk about it is that the supply of money is related to the prices in the economy or inflation. And we can do that with the MV equals PY equation or the Fisher equation. And what this is essentially called a quantity theory of money, where the money supply is essentially determining on a one-to-one basis, or pretty close to a one-to-one basis, the price values. So what is that implying here? It's implying that the velocity of money is being kept pretty constant and that the Y is being pretty constant. So what is this? So this is called velocity. And what velocity is how many times is the number of times the money is used. So, right, so if I have a $10 bill in my pocket and I use it to buy something, then that merchant will take that $10 and use it to buy their supplies or pay their workers or something. And then that person uses it. And so if we look at a period of time, like let's say a 6-month time period or a 12-month time period, how many times did that dollar bill change hands? Velocity, I don't think the FRED database covers that. I don't think. Or maybe it does. It does. We can see here that is it doing it on an annual basis? I'd have to read this more closely here, but let's just look at it, right? We can see here that the velocity of money has fallen quite a bit. I was about to say before I looked at the data, I was about to say it's about 7, but obviously my data is what my notion was is dated from before COVID. We saw quite a significant decline there. Now let's look at the velocity of M2. Same thing. Interesting. So money is not changing hands as often as it used to. And then over here, that y is measuring the real GDP, meaning it's going to be actually relatively fixed. Because if you remember way back to your principles class, the economy is kind of limited by this production possibilities frontier. It kind of limits what the economy can produce. So there's a kind of a natural or kind of an upper limit to what the economy can produce. So if this is relatively fixed, and if this is relatively fixed over time, then you can see that there's that relationship between how much I change my M by and how much my prices change by. And that's what we see essentially here with our quantity theory of money. And that's what we see here. That my inflation rate then is my difference between how much I'm changing my money supply by and the change in the economy. And the argument was that during COVID, is that the money supply was changing by a much larger amount than the economy was changing by. And so that the inflation that we experienced in 2022, 2021, 2023, all of that was caused by the fact that we grew the money supply much faster than the economy was changing by. In general, the US the Federal Reserve likes to see an inflation rate of about 2 to 3%, and it's obviously much greater than that, which means that they've increased the money supply far too much compared to the growth in the economy. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to skip this part here. So if we look at the data is pretty, things do hold pretty well. That if we look at the growth rate of the money supply, we do see a pretty clear relationship between the two, where countries that grow their money supply faster do have higher inflation rate, at least in terms of M1. M2, the data is a little bit messier, but we certainly see that that's for 129 different countries. We do see that pretty strong relationship between the two. That the higher the growth rate of the money supply, the higher the inflation rate. And the biggest consequence of all this is that we see that in countries where the velocity is less predictable, we can see inflation. So part of the problem as well, it's not just the Federal Reserve printed too much cash in 2020, but something unpredictable happened. I don't think you'd find many economists who would have predicted that velocity would have decreased that quickly, that much. But global pandemic makes sense, right? People aren't going out as much, spending the cash as much. They're hunkering down. And so the velocity fell dramatically, which means then that you've got all this cash out there and it's way much more than you expected, given the size of the economy. Hyperinflation, when it happens, so imagine the inflation rate being over 15. Again, I was in Zimbabwe a little bit before 2008. I used my US dollar for almost all of my transactions. It was a pretty destructive time period in Zimbabwe at that point. Zimbabwe is no friend of the United States. The United States doesn't particularly like Zimbabwe either, so I don't think it really minded that the economy was imploding in the early 2000s. And Mugabe wasn't very well liked either, nor his wife, who became the leader of the country after his death. So the economy collapses because when you have an inflation rate, for instance, of 15 billion%, people are just spending the cash to get rid of it as fast as possible. And that's exactly what you see here. Today, we see it in economies like Venezuela, Argentina in the 1990s. The most famous example would be Germany before the rise of Hitler. We had it here in the United States during the Civil War. when we didn't have a kind of a consistent U.S. Um, currency. So we get these kind of examples here where people were like burning the cash, or kids here are using it to build something. And there's always ones of like wallpaper, using wallpaper. The currency basically becomes worthless, and you can kind of see here. This was in Weimar Republic, Germany, before the rise of Hitler, when Germany was paying reparations from World War One, and the value of the currency is just what you got here, 10 billion percent change for the CPI. And eventually, what happens, as is always happens in hyperinflation, is that eventually people stop accepting that rapidly declining value currency, and the economy collapses. People become unemployed, leaders get deposed, and the economy recreates itself. It's very difficult. Once hyperinflation starts, it's really difficult to stop it. And that was certainly the case even in Zimbabwe's case too, which eventually had to just settle on using the US dollar. Because usually the government can't even collect tax revenue anymore because the inflation rate is going up so much and people stop even paying their taxes because the government can't keep paying for workers to collect the taxes. So again, it all gives reason to we need to really control the money supply, which again highlights this idea as we discussed in chapter 1 of why central banks should remain independent. Now, if we go back to that article that I saved right here, we didn't have hyperinflation in the late 1970s, but the inflation rate was pretty high. It exceeded 10%, certainly. What was it here? So if we look at it from a CPI perspective, oh, we can't get far enough back. Let's just look at from sophisticated prices. Oh, wow, you can't even really do that very well. Okay, CPI. Let's look at the oldest data we got here. And let's look at this from edit graph quarterly. And let's look at this percentage change from a year ago. Why? And you see we had pretty high inflation. So this would be the price index, how it's changing from a year ago. You see some pretty high inflation, obviously, during the after World War II, but then again in the 1970s. This is showing the percent change from a year ago, so you have to invert it. And here's the inflation here from a year ago. This would be the, again, if you invert it, you're seeing that there's the positive inflation there. Okay, and so what we see here is kind of to conclude this, what we see is that the more independent of the central bank, the more independent it is, that the lower the average inflation rate is. And to the extent that that central bank is not independent, we see much higher inflation rates. So maybe I'll have you read this article just as an optional article. But this article alone or this graph should highlight to you how important it is to have an independent central bank.